Well, before my clock has started, I'm just going to acknowledge Karen Knowlton, my co-author over there. Wave, Karen. Hi. So I've been doing work for a long time on diversity, and as a white guy, I've thought a lot about the role, different perspectives of the role of the researcher in the discovery and dissemination process. And there's different perspectives epistemologically. On the one end, we can think about the researcher as somebody who's detached, like kind of a clinician who's objectively pushing through and discovering information and then distributing it. On the other end of the spectrum, we can think about a social construction process where the researcher is, their biases and experience, in my case, lack of experience with discrimination, is informing a number of judgment calls during a number of critical junctures. So thinking of analogs to that latter point, the possibility that our biases and experiences are informing the process, I thought about in the practitioner world, what are analogs to this, one of which is when white men try to be allies to minorities in the fight for workplace equality. And when they unfortunately misstep because they are misguided by their lack of experience. So we've been interested in identifying some of the tripwires that white men and other dominant group members can occasionally face. We've taken a couple of, looking at the two dominant pillars of social perception, so 90%, or a little bit more than 90% of social judgments tend to cluster into two different categories. They're labeled different things in different areas of research. For our purposes, we're calling them the willingness to help and the ability to help. So thinking about concerns with respect to dominant group members' ability to help, well, on the one hand, we can think about issues where white men, because by default they're accustomed to roles, including being coaches and mentors and giving advice, and so they end up imploring women and minorities or giving advice rather than recognizing that it's oftentimes most helpful for undercutting equality by taking subordinate roles. This is akin to the white savior dilemma that's been talked about widely, especially in the media. You think about movies such as The Blind Side and The Help that a lot of people find charming, but can have, or you can think about them having layers of this notion that minority advancement is predicated on the dependence of dominant group members. And so by acting in roles that involve giving advice and consultation, we can end up reinforcing rather than undercutting historical divides. One example, actually is the first example that made me want to pursue this project, was this article that focused on Vivek Wadhwa, where he was constantly imploring women to be very forward with their goals and to lean in. And then this very much frustrated a lot of the people that he was talking to. So for example, one CEO said, I think his intentions are good, but that he became a spokesman for women in tech is symptomatic of an industry that seems bent on listening to men over women. Another category that we've looked at involves exhibiting a lack of relevant knowledge. This is more aligned with what my preamble at the outset. So lack of relevant knowledge when it comes to, let's say overhiring personnel practices or hiring practices, or coming up with new policies. The lack of subjective first-person knowledge, first-person experience, not having, for example, ever been the target of a slur, not having experienced more subtle forms of discrimination. In what ways does that leak into the process of trying to generate solutions, perhaps leading to suboptimal solutions? And this kind of gets at the notion of these adages of perspective taking and of empathy. There are clear limits to them. There's only so much you can imagine certain scenarios. You actually have to experience them. Then we think about the concerns about the willingness to help. So ostensibly, when people are asserting the desire to be allies, it appears that their willingness is pretty apparent, but underneath the surface, they could have hidden or ulterior motives. And so we've been looking at when are there occasions when people assert that they want to help, but they actually don't really want to help. The most pernicious cases involve when helping, in shutter quotes, within gatekeeper role in order to reinforce dominant hierarchical position. In this case, when dominant group members end up changing policies more because they want to control and indebt minorities and actually establish that minorities can only advance if they're adjusting standards themselves. And this actually ends up reinforcing rather than undercutting this notion of privilege. And one example of this is, despite overhauling training policies, whites still think of us as unqualified. Old biases, attitudes, and beliefs stack the cards against us, by Jones in the mid-'80s. So finally, we can think about when whites, dominant group members, want to gain reputational advantages by acting as allies. The status and credibility that often comes with appearing to be altruistic, the ironic consequence that one of the best ways to gain selfishly is to act as if you're being selfless. So in the context of being an ally, there are many corporations right now, they have certain stakeholders, certain people they're trying to recruit, that very much love progressive messages, and so for optics reasons, they might present themselves as buying into these progressive initiatives without actually having a deep commitment. This is a big problem because if there's actual controversy or vulnerability, they won't actually stick with these particular initiatives. So one example of this is the firm that commissioned the Fearless Girl statue actually doesn't compensates their women about 70% relative to their men, and actually was the subject of a lawsuit as a result. So they're frustrated at the hypocrisy. So lately we've been looking at, okay, what are ways that dominant group members can establish the willingness and ability to help? One being deference. So deference reverses the traditional historical hierarchy, and it also allows people to better figure out through inquiry how they can most help. This is a nice quote here. Thank you.